So, Stuart, given the feedback that MEPS gets from its research partners in global steel markets, how much interest is there in green steel?
The interest is very high. From our research partners, we do get the feedback that they are willing and open to what the steel producers are doing, whether it's from the integrated mills or from the mini mills, and they're also trying to understand the legislation behind that as well. But what comes out loud and clear from our market research is that there's a lack of understanding in that term or that phrase, green steel. If you take green steel, essentially all what that means is to decarbonize the emissions from both operations and from other operations too, such as on the induction furnaces. But essentially, if you look at the blast furnace, and I think it's important to just convey this, if you look at a blast furnace, at this stage, the input fuel used is natural gas, and what that does in terms of the carbon in that natural gas, it removes the oxygen from the ferric oxides, and that gets released in the atmosphere as CO2. If you look alternatively on the EAF side, I think what's more important there is in terms of the input or the energy, where that comes from. And there's a drive for the EAF producers to go onto the renewable side of the energy.
So there's several facets in that understanding, I suppose, really, people understanding what green steel is exactly and also what the processes are. John, I know that MEPS have done an awful lot of investigation. They've surveyed on how receptive buyers are to green steel at the moment. What's your understanding of where the market's at?
Well, I think where we are at the moment is you can't say the word green steel without adding the word premium on afterwards. At the moment, buyers are very concerned about any kind of additional cost that's going to be added because of these measures. We're hearing numbers ranging from, say, 150 euros to 200 euros as a standard. And really, to ask somebody to pay that as an addition on the kind of tons that are being sold, it's really not happening at the moment. There are a few industries that are sort of driving a bit of demand for it, but at the moment, it's that extra cost that isn't being absorbed. There's the market's fairly quiet at the moment, fairly dead, and asking to pay this big extra chunk on top, it's really not happening at the moment.
I think at MEPS, certainly I recall in MEPS meetings, we've used the phrase 50 shades of green in the past because of that lack of definition, what green steel actually means as a term. Are there any defined specifications in the market so people know what they're getting?
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of the things that we see quite regularly. There's a lot of confusion about what exactly is green steel, and essentially it's removing those carbon emissions from the process of making the steel, and really removing anything from your production process is going to be beneficial in the long run. That's where we get these sort of different shades of green. What we probably really need is some kind of guidance, maybe some additional legislation, putting sort of some boundaries around these emissions. I know a lot of people are sort of asking for that at the moment. Until then, we get a sort of a situation where steelmakers are kind of left to their own devices. They can decide whether a product's green or not, and they can do that by offsetting carbon emissions within sort of the energy they're buying. There's a whole bunch of different ways they can do that, and that's why we get sort of this accusation of greenwashing. And I think until we get sort of additional guidance or legislation, or the industry really decides where it wants to be with this, that's going to continue.
So, Stuart, you've already mentioned part of the process. We did a previous podcast where we interviewed H2 Green Steel's head of commercial, who gave us great insight into their process, which is at the extreme end, I guess, of green steel production. Is that the way things are going, or is the wider market likely to rely on more traditional methods?
No, I think especially the European market, and I can also say for the rest of the world, definitely the transition is well on its way, especially here in Europe and also the UK, I might add. There's just one point I just want to just expand on what John said. So again, that premium of 150 to 200 euros a ton. So from our market research, that is quite narrow, but if you look at, say, the wider market, there's anything from 50 euros a metric ton all the way up to 400 euros a metric ton, which is quite a wide range and just shows you the disparity of feedback that certain buyers in Europe are actually receiving from the steel producers. Then coming back to H2 Green Steel, I think that from that interview, it was quite apparent that it's not just the process there on site that is important, although that is really extremely important. It's on either side of the supply chain. It's with regard to the incoming raw materials, whether or not that's for a blast furnace or if it's for electric arc furnace. And even further downstream, it's important for those suppliers to be confident of the total supply chain and the sustainability of that. One other thing that is quite important to take note of is that when you look at the right at the beginning of the supply chain, what's happening to carbon release there? We all know that mining also releases carbon into the atmosphere. It might be smaller, and definitely is, than say in terms of iron and steel production, but that's also included, and the logistics, the shipping, and further downstream applications. So all those elements of the supply chain in total, not just the steel producing, are important factors.
And do you think all those factors will play into the size of that premium? Will certificates need to be passed on to prove that all that due diligence is actually carried through?
Absolutely. In fact, there are some test certificates already being issued into the market, reflecting that it is a greener steel and the CO2 emission level is low. But in saying that, if you take, for example, electric arc furnace at the moment, the release of CO2 is in the region. It can vary from operation to operation, but 0.6 tons of CO2 per ton of steel produced, versus, say, blast furnace around about the 2-ton level of CO2. So it is lower already. However, again, out of the interview that you had with H2 Green Steel, it was very interesting to note that Stephen Flapper did make a comment of saying any reduction in your existing operation on carbon release is important. And it's important to note as well that electric arc furnace, if they are releasing at 0.6, they need to look at ways of even lowering that further.
Absolutely. John, one thing we've touched on a lot in previous Speaking of Steel podcasts has been ETS scheme and the CBAM that's coming in both in Europe and the UK. If they're doing one thing, they're ensuring that suppliers are getting better and better at recording the emissions embedded in the steel they produce. How does that legislation interplay with the green steel that we're now seeing?
I think that legislation is something that's is really needed. A lot of the people that we've spoken to have said they're a little bit unclear as to how this sort of this whole process is going to play out, and they really need some kind of guidance. So this legislation is going to help set these rules for people producing in the EU, for people that are importing into the EU, and it's going to be set in an equivalent manner so that emissions within the region and without are all treated in the same way.
Absolutely. So, the one thing will certainly feed into the other and transform the market to a degree, I suppose.
Yeah, I think it's got to be understood that we're really sort of at the start of this whole process. The actual reduction of any free allocation or any CBAM charge hasn't even started yet. It's not going to happen until 2026, and that's going to be phased in gradually over the course of 10 years. What the aim of that is to do is to give everybody a chance to sort of acclimatise to these new measures. One thing I must say though about the H2 green steel is they're in a place where they've really got everything going for them. Yeah. They've got the ability to get this 100% renewable energy, which a lot of other steel producers in Europe don't, and they're going to be having to pay a sort of a much higher cost for it. So it'd be really interesting to see how this sort of plays out when they do start producing, because essentially they've got all the advantages. They've got that sort of first mover advantage as well. So hopefully their project is a success, and they can actually sort of show the rest of the industry how they can make these changes.
Ultimately, they will have to compete with other existing steelmakers on price, though, to become a success.
Yeah, they will have to compete on price. Like I say, they're going to have a little bit of an advantage because they're going to be able to target some of the markets where there already is that demand for green steel, where customers are actually sort of asking for it. Now, the automotive industry is one that's seems to be sort of leading the way, and this is first of all because there's more sort of advanced legislation on the emissions associated with the cars, with the vehicles they're producing. So there's that push at one end from the sort of legislation, but then there's also people want to reduce emissions within their sort of their day-to-day lifestyle, and so these they're beginning to actually look at this in more detail.
But it was quite interesting what you said earlier in terms of the administration side of things. Also, the feedback that we get is like from the market is the amount of administration involved in terms of their reporting level, and so much so that they have to now look at a third-party company maybe to take that administration over, because it's just too much for them to handle with their existing structure, and that will also incur a cost.
Yeah, it's there are quite a few businesses that have sort of popped up in the past sort of year or two since we've heard of this extra legislation with this extra paperwork that needs to be submitted, that are offering the services where they essentially do. They essentially sort of set up these little departments, or they set up a process for companies whereby they can actually get this reporting done. Yeah. That's of course that's as over and above the actual monetary value. That's another cost people need to absorb.
So at the moment, whether you're selling green steel or normal products, then you have to record and evidence the emissions in those products now because of the legislation.
Well, I think it will ultimately form part of the quality or ISO systems, and that will form part of the traceability of the product.
Okay, so in terms of the makeup of sort of global markets of green steel, we know what's happening in Sweden now. That's it's clearly a bit of a forerunner in terms of the greenest of green steel. Are there other areas, John, other countries where there's going to be a clear advantage and perhaps strides are already being made towards green steel?
Well, I think that there's a natural advantage. Some countries do have a natural advantage at the moment. Like you say, sort of the emissions, the CO2 emissions we're associating with a ton of blast furnace produced steel is around about sort of 2 tons. Whereas if it's produced in an electric arc furnace, like you say, that's not about sort of 0.5, 0.6 tons. Yeah. So already there's that big advantage there. We see places like the USA, they've got a high percentage of their material is being produced in electric arc furnaces. So naturally their emissions are going to be lower. Other countries, Turkey, for example, they've got a large percentage of arc furnaces producing their steel. Whereas other countries, obviously China, India, are going to be at the other end of that scale. I think about 89% material in China is produced by a blast furnace.
And it's quite interesting as well, that you brought up the comparison with, say, the USA and Europe. Is that our market research indicates, say, in Europe, even though the level of interest is there from both the US side and Europe, it tends to be more from the European side, because the central governments or the legislation involved is being pushed a lot more there, as opposed to, say, the US. And you get that indication that, or the feeling that, yes, it is there, but we're already there. But as we know, there's a lot more work to be.
Well, yeah, I mean
US.
that's one of the major bones of contention of the Global Climate Club, or the general agreement.
That's a good expression
on steel. That's basically the negotiations currently happening between Europe and North America. North American market, so about 2/3 of it, the steel being produced by electric arc furnaces. That number's lower in Europe. That's about 45%. And one of the main sort of bones of contention at the moment is the American mills, or the American legislators, do not want to push the American steel mills to make improvements, because of course there's a cost that comes with it, until the European steel mills have made sort of comparative savings. Whereas the European point of view is more of everybody should be trying to make some kind of saving. So this talk that we've had for the past 3 or 4 years of the Climate Club really has sort of stalled.
And in particular, I mean, one of the key considerations with any manufacturer starting to develop green steel methods of production will be, where do we sell it to? So I think we mentioned automotive. Are there other areas where green steel at this point in time is something that sort of must be specified in a project?
So we're seeing it mainly with automotive. Like I say, that's because there's going to be tightening rules about lifetime emissions associated with the vehicles they're producing. But we're also beginning to see similar legislation being discussed and talked about for an overall sort of emissions life cycle for new building projects as well. I expect that's going to be sort of fairly targeted to begin with, and as with the rest of this sort of this legislation, it's going to take. There's going to be sort of a bedding in period, but I really see those as two of the main sectors that are going to be leading the way. One thing I would love to see is some kind of subsidy or award for the production of renewable energy. So the steel that's going into building the wind turbines and the solar panels, if there was perhaps some kind of incentive there for green steel to be used, and that whole virtuous circle helping this whole process.
Absolutely. That was an interesting comment in the H2 Green Steel interview, actually, that they themselves have been struggling to source the raw materials for development of the plant that they might have liked to have used. So.
I think from the steel producer's point of view, it's the onus is really going to lie not only in the industry in general, but particularly on the steel producers. They need to really drive this initiative. And I think to a certain extent they have. Their marketing has been very good, especially at the Tube and Wire Fair earlier this year. But also in terms of tightening up in terms of their own understanding and drive, whether it's technical or whether it's in terms of legislation. But also, I think the main criteria here, we all know that it's a tremendous cost, this total transition. And it's the investor confidence at the end of the day that will also just give this impetus. And the steel producers need to gain the confidence of the investor.
So Stuart, we talked a little bit about the steel making process. In terms of sort of the raw materials that are used, what needs to change to sort of drive that green transition then?
I think your input materials, obviously for electric arc furnace, there's already scrap being utilized, but more and more there's momentum towards also supplementing that feed into the EAF with DRI, which is direct reduced iron, which is made off-site as an input material. I think the important thing there is why you can effectively say it's a green version of iron ore lumps, as it were, is that you reduce it utilizing hydrogen. So as if it could be explained another way, it's just the first part of EAF production. And then secondly, in terms of electric arc furnace, with the input scrap, that is extremely important, and the sorting out of the different grades that will further complement the mix and reduce the CO2. Alternatively, on the blast furnace side, the most important aspect there is the input, as I've mentioned earlier, in terms of hydrogen, but also DRI feed can also be put into the blast furnace to form the iron.
More development, more admin, and something that H2 Green Steel have in their plans, of course.
Oh, absolutely. But I think what's also important in terms of DRI is the stability of that final product. When you initially produce DRI, it is unstable. You have to reduce that surface area to make it stable, and that will then allow ease of transport and the safety aspect comes into play there. That also comes at a cost.
Absolutely. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me on the Speaking of Steel sofa again today. I think we've had a great chat around green steel today, and it really underlines that conversation that, as I say, we had previously with our interview with H2 Green Steel. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Speaking of Steel. Please be sure to subscribe and join us again for the next episode.